There's a few things we have to configure before we can implement MVC in our course project. Now, I went ahead and implemented the dependencies that we need for our course project. I upgraded our existing project to the new RC2 version. In this case, let's look at a few references you need in your ASP.NET Core application to implement MVC. So if we look at our project.json file, you'll see right here Microsoft.ASP.NET Core MVC. We have that imported into our application. And we also have Microsoft ASP.NET Core Razor.tools. We need to pull in the MVC NuGet package reference, and we also need to pull in Razor to implement our views. A few other tools that we're importing from here is the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Razor tools. And we're importing the version of Preview 1 Final. So keep that in mind when we're implementing our different views. Also, a key item you want to look at is the ASP.NET Core static files. So we can emit static files inside of our views, especially with our layout templates. We want to make sure that we implement that NuGet reference so that when we build our layout templates, we can utilize whatever in the www root folder. If we want to import jQuery, semantic UI, or different client-side reference libraries, we need to make sure that we have the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core static files NuGet reference. So now that we have that all set up and everything in our project.json is set up, let's go to our startup.cs. Now in section 3, I implemented all this from scratch. I'm just trying to give you an overview. I'm just trying to give you an overview of the items that we covered in that section so that you know how to implement the different items in your project.json and your startup.cs. I'm just trying to give a brief overview of what we covered in section 3 related to configuring MVC. We have our startup class, and then we have our startup constructor that is setting our configuration builder. And then in our configure services, we're adding application insight telemetry. And then we have to come in here and we have to inject MVC into our application. So right here, we are adding MVC to our configure services method. And then once we add the MVC service, we have to configure its pipeline. So right here, for the HTTP request pipeline, we go down here and we say app use MVC. We're mapping the MVC route associated with the main controller and the main action. So in this case, I've mapped it to controller home and the action index. So when our application starts, it's going to map the route to the home controller and the action index on that home controller. That's going to be my default route. I can associate other routes in my project, but for simplicity, I'm going to map that as my baseline route. So now that I've added MVC to my project and my configure services, I've added my MVC route associated in my configure method. Now I have to configure my main home controller and the action associated on that controller, and then implement a view to associate with my map route method here. So let's go over to my course project, and I'm going to click add new folder, and I'm going to call it controllers. This is the naming convention in our project. And then I'm going to come in here, I'm going to add new folder. I'm going to call it views. And then since we're implementing our controller and views, I'm going to go ahead and add the model folder. This is where our business logic classes will be implemented right here. So now that we have our controllers, models, and views in our application, let's go over here to our controller and let's click add new item. And let's do MVC controller class. And by default, you'll see down here, it's home controller. So that's what we want to implement because it has to match the route in our configure method on our startup.cs file. So right there, I have my index method on my home controller. So let's go down to my views and let's click add new folder. And the folder has to match the naming convention of your controller. So in this case, it's home controller. Let's put home. Then once we put home, let's add a new item, and we're going to put MVC view page. And then the naming convention has to match the map route, which in this case, it's index. So right here in index, this is my default view associated with my home controller. So in this case, just to implement this real quick, I'm not going to return an iAction result. This is the interface associated with the Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC. All of your different return types are associated with this interface. In this case, I just want to return a string to see if my MVC routing is working. So let's put string here. And inside of this, let's actually return a string. And let's say my MVC default route. Once I do that, let's go ahead and rebuild this application. And let's run this in the browser. And this should be printed onto the page associated with my index view. So let's look at this. And look at that. You can see my routes are being implemented within my ASP.NET Core project because right now you see my MVC default route, which is printing from the index view. So let me rebuild this so we can stop debugging. So just one quick overview of everything we covered. We went down here to our project.json. We made sure that we implemented the ASP.NET Core MVC, Razor tools, and the static file NuGet references in our project. We also added the Razor tools associated in our project. We want to make sure we import that for tooling. Then we want to close that out. Then we go to our startup.cs, make sure that we inject the MVC service in our configure service method, and that we define our default map route to associate with our main controller and a default action on that controller. Then once we implemented all of that, then we came over here and we created our controllers, our models, and our views folder. And our default controller is the home controller. And in this case, I just made the return type of a string. So this is the default action on my home controller. I changed the iActionResult to a string type, which returned my MVC default route. And then what I did from there is I created a view folder. And inside of my view folder, I created home to match to the home controller. And then inside of that, I didn't put anything in the index page. I just allowed it to be referenced through my route. Remember that your controller, the controller method has to match the view page that you make in your views folder. So I have home, and then I have index.cshtml. In this case, I'm just emitting a string to my view, and in turn, this gave us my MVC default route. This is how we configure MVC in our ASP.NET Core project. In section 3, I covered how to implement all your dependencies from scratch. In this case, I wanted to give you an overview of what you have to inject in the configure service method, in the configure method, and then creating your controllers, creating your views and your models, and then we returned a string to associate in our index.cshtml page. So in the next lecture, we'll actually start delving into creating our default layout page for our ASP.NET Core project. I want to thank you for joining me in this lecture. Have a nice day.